Hello and welcome to our first Asian American Pacific Islander history lesson that we'll be hosting. This is actually going to be a two-part series. The first lesson we're pre-recording like you see right now, and by the time you guys see this, the second lesson will have already happened live, but we'll also be recording that one so you can follow up with that one later. But we're hosting this event for Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which is happening right now in May, in hopes that people will be able to leave with a little bit more knowledge about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, because we all know that not much of it is covered in school, especially about Pacific Islanders. So as long as you leave today knowing a little more than you knew coming in, then I'll consider our little lesson today a success. So this time we're going to be covering three different main topics. We're going to start with Asian Americans today, and that includes the recent rise in anti-Asian racism due to the pandemic, and also Asian American media representation. And then finally, we're going to end with the first major wave of Asian immigration. So that'll be when the actual history starts coming in. But for Asian Americans today, we've seen the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. There's been a ton of reporting on it. And really the reporting on it really ramped up maybe in the past 6 months or so, but it had already been happening at least a year ago in March 2020 when the coronavirus first hit. And this is due to coronavirus and its perceived association with China. And those perceptions have been inflamed by some people who choose to call coronavirus the Chinese virus, the Kung flu, the Wuhan virus, anything like that. And what that really does is it really associates specifically Chinese people with the virus. But in the eyes of the majority of Americans, anyone remotely East Asian looking or Southeast Asian looking is automatically Chinese. So even though people are targeting China when they say things like China virus, sentiment like that really comes back to affect almost all Asian Americans, excluding South Asian Americans because they don't look as similar to East Asian Americans or Southeast Asian Americans. I mean, there was a story of a Burmese man in Texas who was shopping at Sam's Club with his maybe 2-year-old son, and they got attacked by someone with a knife and they had to get stitches afterward because the attacker thought they were Chinese. Clearly they weren't, they were Burmese, and that's actually not even East Asian, it's Southeast Asian, but they were still attacked anyway. But there's actually been some historical precedent for the rise in anti-Asian racism that we've been seeing. It's similar to Yellow Peril in the 1800s, and we'll be talking about that later in this presentation, but that was basically just an anti-East Asian sentiment for anyone who looked East Asian. Is mostly directed towards the Chinese at first, and then definitely towards the Japanese as Japan started becoming more of a superpower, and definitely after Pearl Harbor and during World War II when Japan was one of America's adversaries. And even back then, it wasn't anti-Chinese sentiment like we see right now, it was anti-Japanese sentiment, but it still affected anyone that looked East Asian or Southeast Asian. There's a man called Vincent Chin that we'll also be talking about, but he was thought to be Japanese by a couple men, and he was really bludgeoned to death, even though he was Chinese American. So there's this trend of most Americans not being able to distinguish between the different Asian ethnicities, or even really the sub-regions like East Asians and Southeast Asians. And so when you consider that, it really goes to show that an attack on one Asian ethnicity, an attack on one Asian American subgroup is really an attack on all of us because it comes back to affect all of us.
So I wanted to dedicate a huge portion of this presentation to the Asian American representation in media, because a lot of how we see Asian Americans today comes from media, the media portrayal of them. So I wanted to open up with a movie. It's pretty recent and controversial called Ghost in the Shell. And this movie got under fire because Scarlett Johansson was casted for the main character who was supposed to be Japanese. And this led to a lot of people calling this a classic case of whitewashing. And what is whitewashing exactly? Well, it kind of just refers to the term when white actors are given roles for characters who are non-white, and it has been going on like as early as the 1900s, ever since Hollywood started. And this is a problem because many Asian actors are not really getting the roles they deserve, or they're just not getting as many acting roles as their white coworkers. One interesting example is this half white, half Chinese actress whose name was Chloe Wong. However, she felt that it was really hard to find acting roles and calls back with their Asian sounding last name. But when she changed her name to Chloe Bennett, which was named after her father's first name, she cited that she was able to gain a lot more attention and roles because of this, her new white sounding name. And as for the few times Asians get movie roles, they mostly get roles that perpetuate stereotypes. And these roles are not necessarily all bad, but they lead to a lack of real diversity for Asian actors. And most of these roles are pretty predictable and cliches, such as the martial artist, the nerdy guy, or even like ethnic specific stereotypes like the super violent and backwards Mongol. And they usually just end up as characters who serve as the butt ends of jokes. I'm gonna play a um, movie clip of um, Mickey Rooney portraying Mr. Yunioshi in Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is a classic case of whitewashing and an overall offensive portrayal of Japanese people.
Mr. Go right away. Someday, Mr. Go right away. What happened to you anyway? You take off for the powder room, and that's the last I see you.
Now, really, Harry?
Harry was the other guy. I'm Sid Arbuck. You like me, remember? Mr. Go right away. I protest.
Oh, darling, I am sorry, but I lost my key.
But that was 2 weeks ago. You cannot go on or keep ringing my bell. You disturb me. You must have a key made.
But it won't do any good. I just lose them all.
Come on, baby. You like me. You know you do.
I worship you, Mr. Arbuck, but good night, Mr.
Hold on,
Arbuck.
baby. Wait a minute. What is this? You like me. I'm a liked guy. You like me, baby. You know you do. In 30 seconds, I got to call the police. All the time a disturbance. I can't no sleep. I got to get to my rest. I'm an artist. I got to call a vice squad on you.
Don't be angry, you dear little man. I won't do it again. You promised not to be angry. I might let you take those pictures we mentioned.
When?
Sometime.
Anytime.
Good night.
Okay, I'm just gonna pause right there. Yeah, I think you guys can get the idea of why that's really offensive. So next I want to go over how these stereotypes can have really negative effects on how we view Asian Americans, as there is a case to be made of the violence against Asian women specifically due to the media having sort of a super sexualized portrayal of them. And one play I wanted to talk about is Miss Saigon, which is centered during the Vietnam War. And in short, an American soldier meets a young Vietnamese woman at a brothel. They fall in love and the woman is impregnated. The soldier returns home and marries someone else while the woman back in Vietnam is struggling to make ends meet with her newborn child. And when the soldier returns, he can't just leave his wife, so this ultimately leads to the young woman killing herself. And this particular play, like many others in the past, played a classic sort of trope, I guess, of fetishizing Asian women. And the content was pretty sexist. And it also promoted a helpless damsel in distress image. I won't go too in depth, but there's an article by Vietong Nguyen, our previous guest speaker, that delves into this article, and I think it's well worth the read. As for the future of Asian American representation, I wanted to start with #JohnCho. This sort of trend came after the director Aaron Sorkin wrote, "There aren't any Asian movie stars," in an email regarding casting for a movie he was directing. And it was obviously a pretty controversial statement, which led to a trend where people started photoshopping pictures of John Cho in famous Hollywood movies. And it was just a way to show that Asian actors are fit for the big screen and can be huge stars that can be perfectly fitting in large Hollywood movies. Recent movies have also started providing more Asian American representation. For example, Crazy Rich Asians, that show that majority Asian casts can be profitable with large box office gains. Always Be My Maybe proved that Asians can be portrayed as regular people and regular couples. And Raya the Last Dragon showcased the beauty of Asian cultures that weren't just East Asian. Finally, I wanted to add a fun nostalgia slide of Asian American YouTubers. See if you guys can recognize any of them. Because when YouTube started up, I felt like it was just a way for anyone, no matter their interests or backgrounds, they could just have fun and put themselves out there in a video format. And in the early 2010s, like especially Asians had pretty low like representation in media, but I felt like it was a golden age in YouTube, as it was a chance for them to express themselves.
All right, so we're going to talk about early Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders from the year 1500 to 1850. So, early Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. A brief history on the Philippines. The Philippines was colonized by Spain in the 16th century, and after the Philippines Revolution and the Spanish-American War, the Philippines was ceded by Spain to the U.S. in the 1898 Treaty of Paris. After the 1899 Battle of Manila, the Philippine-American War broke out, which resulted in the U.S. taking control over the Philippines, which was then administered as an insular area. So moving on to the first Filipino settlement in the U.S., which was located in Morro Bay, California in the year 1587. You can actually see a picture of that. It's going to be the one on the right. The first Filipinos came as sailors on the Spanish-Filipino-Mexican galleon trade, and they settled in California and also in Louisiana. After the Philippines became a U.S. colony, there was even more Filipino immigration. And the 1970 U.S. Census documented the population of Filipinos to be just over 300,000. Of course, nowadays we have many more Filipino Americans in the U.S. And the two events that caused the waves of immigration were the elimination of national origin quotas and the Immigration Act of 1990. All right. So we're also going to talk about the annexation of Hawaii, and I'll show you a short video clip about that.
The Kingdom of Hawaii remained a fairly remote, disconnected country for many years, until these guys arrived. During the 17 and 1800s, many people from Europe and the United States came to visit Hawaii, mainly on expeditions of exploring the ocean, but the ones that stayed were mainly Americans, who arrived to these islands wanting to talk about Jesus. For the most part, the Kingdom of Hawaii welcomed these visitors. One British explorer even gifted the Hawaiian king a British flag, and Hawaii eventually adopted the British flag into their own flag. There was general friendship and good relations here. The American missionaries who had settled on the island eventually had kids and grandkids. And soon, these missionaries and their descendants weren't just interested in talking about Jesus. They were also interested in building businesses, mainly focused on sugar.
By far the most valuable single product Hawaii can offer in that trade is sugar.
With this increased economic interest, these Americans who had originally come to be missionaries were now much more into sugar. And they did what people of European descent have been doing for many centuries, looking at a culture and government that is different than theirs and saying, we think we could do this better. Let us take it from here. And so during the 1800s, these Americans slowly chipped away at the Hawaiian government structure. They were still newcomers in this ancient island nation. They didn't have much power, but that changed quickly.
The Pacific always comes rolling in, mile upon mile of dazzling white beaches.
By the end of the 1800s, these Jesus Sugar Americans had amassed a huge amount of Hawaii's wealth. And those original missionaries who had come to the island to convert people to their religion years earlier now had grandkids that looked like this. A full-on armed militia of white Hawaiian citizens, descendants of the missionaries, who were eager to get the government out of the way so that they could run the country themselves and help make it more favorable for their sugar businesses. Now remember, these guys were born in Hawaii. They considered themselves Hawaiians. But even still, their loyalty still lie with the country of their ancestors. They were effectively Americans still. By 1893, this local white militia and their political allies were ready for a full-on takeover of the government, which at the time was headed by this woman, Queen Liliuokalani. The sugar missionaries were still a minority, and a full-on overthrow of the government would have been hard by themselves. But luckily for them, they had help. The American ambassador of Hawaii at the time helped coordinate the arrival of an American military ship and troops to show up on the shores of the island of Oahu into the capital city of Honolulu. Up until this point, the conflict in Hawaii was technically internal, meaning it was between the locals and the white missionaries who were technically locals because they were born there. But the moment the US arrived to Honolulu to provide military backup for a government overthrow, it became a full-on military coup sponsored by a foreign power, a cardinal sin in international relations. But even still, the government backed the overthrow. The Queen was forced to give up her power, and they put this guy as the leader of the new Republic of Hawaii. His name was Sanford Dole. His family was huge in the sugar business.
There's a new taste in pineapple from Dole.
And now he was the leader of the country of Hawaii. The locals fought this, but peacefully. They protested. Nearly every adult on the islands signed a petition condemning the takeover. Back in Washington, D.C., a debate began as to what to do with Hawaii now that a bunch of pro-American missionaries turned sugar warriors had grabbed power. Dole himself traveled to D.C. to lobby for the U.S. to take over Hawaii for themselves. But so did a group of local Hawaiians to oppose the American encroachment. The Queen, who was overthrown, wrote a letter demanding to be reinstated as the legitimate leader of the Kingdom of Hawaii. The United States was split on what to do until 1898, when the new president surrounded himself with leaders who kind of loved war and American expansion. And this is what sealed the fate of Hawaii. All of these displays of vehement, peaceful protests by the Hawaiian people were trampled on by a superpower who had bigger guns and an insatiable desire for control.
All right, so I hope you learned a lot more about the history of Hawaii and why Hawaii is not, and why Hawaii, although it is a state, officially a state in the United States, there is a dark and traumatic history behind that event. All right. Now let's talk about the first wave of Asian American immigration, starting from 1850 and going into the 1900s. All right, so in the first wave of Asian American immigration, throughout the first half of the 19th century, Chinese manual laborers, predominantly men, migrated to the West Coast where they found employment in agriculture, mining, railroad construction, and other low-skilled jobs. In response to the negative public sentiment and organized labor lobbying, Congress in 1882 passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the first legislation aimed at excluding certain foreigners based on their origin. So these laborers were treated extremely poorly because the demand was high for cheap labor and they were willing to take on these jobs for very little pay. These people mostly worked in sugarcane plantations, and also many tried their luck during the gold rush. I'm sure, as many of us know, many Chinese Americans especially were involved in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which took many lives. And in 1905, there was the establishment of the Asiatic Exclusion League, which was an organization formed in the 20th century in the US and Canada that aimed to prevent immigration of people of Asian origin. So as we can see here, there is a long-rooted and deep history of anti-Asian xenophobia.
As Victoria said earlier, one important term to know is yellow peril. It was basically just the overall negative view of Asians, particularly East Asians, at this time, because the West viewed the East as dangerous to their civilization. And this has ultimately led to xenophobia, fear, and like direct discrimination. And violent acts have also been committed, such as the Chinese Massacre of 1871 and the Rock Springs Massacre of 1886. So the Chinese Massacre of 1871 started more as a justification of the death of a white rancher that was caught between gunfire between two rival Chinese gangs. While it was right to be angry of the murder, it did not justify the actions of the large 500 people mob that stormed the LA Chinatown, which ultimately resulted in 19 Chinese people killed. And at this time, this is around 10% of the LA Chinese population, and most of them were not part of the original gang that started the conflict. The other massacre that I'm going to be covering is the Rock Springs Massacre that occurred 15 years later in Rock Springs, Wyoming. And this case is a perfect embodiment of the effects of the Yellow Peril, as well as the growing resentment against Asians, and more specifically, Chinese Americans. In Rock Springs, many of the new Chinese laborers began taking up mining jobs because they were willing to work at a lot lower wages. Their white coworkers demanded for high wages, but the Chinese disagreed, which led to disagreement between the parties, which eventually led to disputes that raged on, which leading to the death of a Chinese miner. The white miners then also returned home to arm themselves with weapons and then went on a riot to the Rock Springs Chinatown. And in the end, a minimum of 28 Chinese people died from the mob, and dozens of buildings and homes were also burned as a result. So here are our works cited. Thanks for coming to day one of the Asian American history lessons. Thank you for coming. I hope you guys enjoyed.